Warzone Season 1 on Urzikstan is finally here, and I've got for you guys the best settings for maximum FPS, lowest input latency, and the best visibility possible, perfect for jumping into the new map. Beginning with the display tab of the graphics settings, display mode, you need to pick between either full screen exclusive or full screen borderless. In terms of how these look, pretty much exactly the same. In terms of how they perform, FPS wise, also very, very similar. However, if you really want to play the game really competitively, full screen exclusive is the best option. It helps lower the input latency just that little bit extra, makes the game feel a lot snappier as you play. If you are someone who likes to alt-tab, do a bit of multitasking, play a little bit more casually, full screen borderless is still very, very good. But me, I'm trying to play competitively. It's going to be full screen exclusive. Moving on, display monitor and adapter. Both of these should be able to be left at default. It should have the correct monitor and GPU selected here. Same goes for screen refresh rate and display resolution. These should automatically be set. Aspect ratio, you can also leave this at automatic. You'll know that this is set weirdly if you start to see your screen stretch in a weird way or see black bars on your screen. For most people, just leave it at auto. Restart shaders preloading. This is an option you can run if you ever run into any weird stuttering, which can happen when your shaders are corrupt and also restarting your game doesn't seem to help. Just click this, let it run. It should fix all of those problems for you. Display gamma, you want to set this to 2.2 if you're on a monitor. If you are playing on a TV screen though, 2.4 is going to be your best bet to make the game look as good as possible. Brightness, by default, this just sets it to 50 and it tells you to look at this guideline up here of what brightness you should be setting. Ignore that and set it at a minimum of 55. That 5 jump in brightness really helps cut through some of those dark corners, and it really helps with seeing those hard to see operators in those scenarios. Constrain mouse to game window is only available if you're running full screen borderless. It will just make it so your mouse can't move onto a second monitor or something while you play, so that's completely personal preference as to what you want to set. For me, running full screen exclusive, it doesn't do anything. Then NVIDIA Reflex low latency, really helpful setting for helping just lower overall input latency, making the game feel a lot more snappy. You definitely want to have this at either on or on plus boost. The choice of this depends on whether you're in a CPU bound case or a GPU bound case. For most setups that people are running with modern PCs, you're going to be in a GPU bound case. So the game is going to be pushing your GPU and your CPU is going to be fine. For that, you just want to set this to on. So most people should run it on. However, if you are someone who has a kind of lower end CPU, you've built a PC on a budget and you've gone for a pretty beefy GPU and you've left that CPU a bit lower, then on plus boost should give you better results. If you don't know which situation you're in, just try both of these out and see which one feels better for you. For me, it's going to be on. Eco mode preset enables power saving features. I know we're living in a bit of cost of living crisis, but I'm not going to let the game lower the power to my system for any reason, so definitely leave this at custom. Then VSync for gameplay and for menus, make sure you leave this off. This introduces a lot of input latency. It's meant to help with screen tearing, which is a bit helpful, but we are not losing latency for the sake of VSync, so definitely keep those off. Custom frame rate limit, you can set it to unlimited here, but I would recommend against it. Instead, click custom, click show more, and then you can set up your individual frame rate limits for in-game, in the menu, and out of focus, so when you've alt-tabbed out the game and you're doing something elsewhere. For gameplay custom frame rate limit, just go all in and max this all the way out, honestly. You don't know what FPS you're going to hit until you start playing the game on Urzikstan, so give it the breathing room it needs when you're actually playing the game. Then menu custom frame rate limit, I'd recommend you keep this at something lower that still feels kind of nice and smooth, so that if you're just navigating the menus or maybe even jumping into the firing range, it still feels kind of nice. But it doesn't need to be maxed out. I don't need the game running at 300 FPS in the menu. So I'm going to run this at 120. Feels very nice and smooth for me. And then out of focus frame rate limit is literally something you can drop all the way down to the lowest. I'm going to go all the way down to 5. If I'm alt-tabbing out of the game to do something over here, the game can basically cease to run in the background for all I care. I need to have access to all of my CPU resource over here. Really important thing to do. Make sure you set this up. Focus mode, you definitely want to put all the way to 0. It's meant to help you focus in on the center of the screen by adding this sort of black overlay around the edges. I don't really know why you'd ever want to use this. Definitely turn this all the way off. And then lastly on here, HDR, high dynamic range. Sounds good in theory that it's going to help improve colors and such, but really this is only for campaigns and games where you purely want to make it look nice. For Warzone, where we want to be as competitive as possible and keep our visibility as high as possible, definitely keep this off, even if you have a HDR monitor. Moving on to the quality tab now, graphic preset, you can just leave this at whatever it's set at. It's gonna change to custom when we change stuff down below anyway. Render resolution and dynamic resolution. Honestly, with the introduction of upscaling methods into the game, there's never really a reason to turn your render resolution down or use dynamic in order to gain FPS. There's just much better ways of doing it. So make sure render resolution's at 100 and dynamic resolution is off. Then for upscaling and sharpening, I'll give you 2 to 3 options depending on your setup. If you are running the game very, very nicely after we've gone through all these settings and you just want to make the game look that little bit more crisp, then you want to select Fidelity FX Cache. This is just a post-processing, upscaling and sharpening method that really makes the game look incredible. Without it, it feels like the game is just that little bit too blurry. Then what you want to do is click show more and change the cache strength to whatever your personal preference is. It doesn't have an effect on FPS. I like 70. I've seen some people like 100. I've seen some people like 50. Try out different settings and see what sharpness looks good for you. If you're struggling to run the game though, then there's 2 more options you can pick from. If you're running an NVIDIA system, then you want to run NVIDIA DLSS. Then come down to show more, put the game to quality in the preset, and then leave the sharpness at 100. What this is actually doing is it will lower the resolution of the game and then use upscaling methods to make it look like you never lowered the resolution. So it still makes the game look very nice and gains you some nice FPS. If you've got an AMD GPU, then you want to run AMD FSR 2.1 and then click show more and put this up to ultra quality as the preset. It's the exact same explanation as DLSS, but if you have an AMD card, you won't have access to DLSS. Hopefully that all makes sense. As I said, I'm going to be running Fidelity FX Cache because my system runs this game very nicely. VRAM scale target is still infamous for catching people out and making people put this all the way to the max because they think that if they set it to the max, then the game has more access to more VRAM and memory and it's going to run better. That's not how this works. Having this too high beyond what the game actually needs will cause more hitching, more potential stuttering, more 1% lows in FPS, so you'll have just random FPS drops all the time. What you should actually be doing is starting with this around 60 is a really good option for pretty much everyone. If you feel like the game is running sluggish at all, then try 70. But don't go any higher unless you're running a really, really old system. Most people are going to get the best results in terms of those 1% lows running 60 or 70. Variable rate shading is an absolute game changer. This didn't exist in Warzone 2 or back in the original Warzone. What it does is, as you can see here, it activates a technique that improves performance at low visual cost by controlling where additional quality is needed in the image. Basically, what it does is the stuff that you're looking at in the middle of the screen, the stuff that you care about, is max quality, rendered in max definition. All the stuff around it that you're never really caring about is actually being rendered in slightly lower quality. And it gains you a ton of FPS in every situation that you're in because you're only having to render in max quality the bit that you're focused on. So turn this on and gain yourself an extra 10 to 15% FPS. Absolute game changer. Before we move on to the next setting, I'd just like to say if you are enjoying this video, finding it informative, and you want to see more of this kind of stuff moving forward for Warzone Season 1 and beyond, then please do consider subscribing down below. It literally takes one click. If you find that you don't like my content moving forward, it's very easy to come back and unsubscribe, but I can guarantee you that the stuff I've got coming is going to be unique, informative, and you're not going to find this kind of stuff anywhere else. So go down and subscribe. Texture resolution determines how good textures look in the game, walls and surfaces around the map, the ground as well. You want to put this to low, so one above the lowest setting of very low. The reason for this is that the FPS difference between these two is negligible. You will not notice a difference, but the visual fidelity increase from going from very low, which looks awful, to low is pretty damn big. So let's go for low on that. Then texture filter anisotropic. This is also known as anisotropic filtering. In many other games, it determines, kind of in conjunction with texture resolution, how good textures look when you're not looking at them head on. So if I look at a wall like this, it's going to look some way. If I look at it from this angle, it'll look a little bit different depending on how the game renders it in. Texture filter anisotropic makes those textures from these angles look a lot better, and it has little to no cost on FPS, so keep this on high. Depth of field, yuck, turn this off. It's this cinematic effect that makes things blur around when you're ADSing. This is going to be an absolute killer to gathering information, staying aware of your surroundings, and general visibility in the game, especially because it looks so grainy when you do it as well. So definitely keep depth of field off. Detail quality level determines the quality of objects on the map. You can see these bushes and these flowers here. Yeah, they do look kind of bad turning this all the way down, but when you're sprinting around the map or you're in a gunfight, you're not going to care how good little rocks and flowers in the game look. I would recommend you turn this all the way down to low for a decent performance benefit. Particle resolution determines the quality of particle effects in-game, specifically those from explosions, fire, thermite grenades like the one over here, and there's two big reasons why you need to turn this all the way down to very low. Number one is FPS. You gain so much FPS turning this down, especially in scenarios where you've got explosions and fire and stuff, which is probably going to happen quite a lot in the madness of Warzone. But also, as you can see here, it actually lowers the amount of particles that are generated from things like thermites and fire and little embers coming off, which can actually hurt visibility as well. So we're killing two birds with one stone by turning this to very low. Bullet impact is completely personal preference. It has no effect on performance, FPS, or anything like that. I like to keep them on because I do find myself going into the firing range and checking recoil patterns of guns while I'm trying to craft my best guns. So yeah, I'll keep it on, but personal preference for you guys. Then persistent effects is kind of similar to bullet impacts, but this is for explosions and fire and things like that and how it leaves burn marks on surfaces. I like to turn these off. I find that to just be visual clutter that doesn't really ever help. Once again, doesn't really have an effect on performance, but just a personal preference thing. I think that it doesn't need to be there. Shader quality is all about how good lighting looks when it interacts with surfaces. Honestly, keeping this on high does make the game look really nice, but unfortunately it really does kill your FPS. So I'd recommend you turn this all the way down to low. It still looks pretty good. You're not really going to miss out on much, and you are going to gain some nice FPS. On-demand texture streaming makes it so that the game will try and download these high-quality textures to your hard drive and then use them to make the game look really nice. Probably good for campaign. For Warzone, I never want my internet to be used for anything like this, and I definitely don't want to use hard drive space for textures that I really don't care about. So we're going to turn that off. And then local texture streaming quality, this determines the quality of textures at kind of really long ranges. We don't care about these. We're going to turn these down to low. When we're playing on Urzikstan and we're doing something over here, I don't care how good a texture looks 200 meters from me. I'm only going to really notice if I stand still and look at it, which I'm never going to be doing. I'm going to be slide cancelling around the map and getting into as many fights as possible. Put it on low. Shadow quality, unsurprisingly, determines the quality of shadows. For this, I think the best option is normal. I see no loss of FPS really going from very low all the way up to normal, and it has the biggest jump in terms of how good those shadows look from a base level. Going to higher ultra, I still continue to lose FPS, but I don't really gain anything in terms of the shadow fidelity in game. So normal, definitely the best option. Screen space shadows are the shadows that appear on kind of local surfaces, as they call them. So mainly you're going to see this on your gun and on your operator's hand and stuff. It makes the game look a little bit more 3D and give you a bit more definition. I quite like this. A lot of people run this off, but you're really not going to gain much in terms of performance from doing so. It will make the overall game look way less 3D, way more flat. So I think in terms of gaining a little bit more visibility and definition in terms of what you're looking at, low is probably the best option. Ambient occlusion adds extra shadows in areas where objects intersect. It adds those really dark areas you can see below this car and in these gaps. You'll find it in corners corners of dark rooms. And as I talk through that, you should understand, we definitely want to turn this off. It does help with performance, but it also lowers the amount of shadowy dark areas that certain sneaky operators might try and hide in. Definitely keep that off. Then screen space reflections, I'm going to turn these off as well. It's just a bit of eye candy, makes reflections look a little bit better, but does have an impact on performance, so off is the best bet for that. And then lastly, in this little section, static reflection quality kind of goes hand in hand with screen space reflections. We're going to put these on the lowest setting because we don't really care about reflections. Moving on to tessellation. I have played around with this setting and I just don't think it does anything. Really, really weird. It doesn't do anything to FPS. It doesn't do anything to visual fidelity. It doesn't do what it says over here. God knows what's going on in the back end. I keep it off just in case it does do anything and potentially causes me any performance troubles. Terrain memory you actually want to max out. It sets the allocated memory size for distant terrain textures, and even though I said earlier we don't care about those distant terrain textures, this has no effect on performance. And it actually helps not just with textures, but also visibility at range. You can actually see operators against certain backgrounds at range. It helps with that target acquisition quite a lot. This is a secret little setting that most people probably put on min, but you definitely should put on max. Then volumetric quality. This is a big no-no. This adds all of these kind of fog areas and sun rays and makes the game look really cinematic. But it's probably one of the biggest killers of FPS in the entire game, so put that on low. Deferred physics quality is to do with the physics quality of water, so how water sort of flows and how realistic it looks. Definitely turn this off, especially jumping into Urzikstan. There's a lot of rivers and areas like that. If you have this turned up, when you go near those areas, your FPS is going to plummet. So definitely keep that off. Weather grid volumes, the quality of weather effects, we don't care about those, turn those off. And water quality, so this is more to do with how light interacts with water and once again the realism of it, we don't care. Turn it off. Moving on to the last area of the in-game settings, the view tab. We've got FOV or field of view. You want to set this to at least 110. Personally, I put it to 120, but I know a lot of people prefer 110 because having it slightly more zoomed in makes it easier to stay on certain targets. It actually makes the targets a little bit bigger. But if you're running anything lower than 110, you're just losing out on so much extra information that you gain from having like your big FOV on the side of your screens. It also makes you feel like you're just running a bit quicker. It makes the game feel so much more fluid than when you're running at something like 100 or dare I say it, 90 FOV. So get your FOV to at least 110. ADS field of view, you want to make sure is at affected. What this will do is rather than when you've got it at independent, where it will just zoom all the way in every time you ADS, it will actually take into account the FOV you've set here. So if you've got a really big FOV, putting ADS field of view to affected means you keep a decent amount of that FOV, so you're still able to keep a good amount of information gained on your screen, even though you're ADS'd. It also helps with visual recoil because the gun won't look like it's bouncing around your screen as much, and it will make it easier to stay on target, so very important you leave this to affected. Weapon field of view is kind of personal preference. I like wide, purely because I ran it all the way through Modern Warfare 2 and Warzone 2. It just makes the gun is a little bit further from my face, but I've seen people like the other two options as well, so just try each of these out and see which one you prefer. Third person field of view, I don't even know if we're getting any third person, but for the sake of it, just max it out because of the same reasons why we maxed out the normal FOV. And then vehicle field of view, I would recommend you put this to wide. Just makes it so that when you're in a vehicle, you've once again got the widest field of view, the most information you can gather as possible, really will help you out. World and weapon motion blur, just turn these off. We don't want motion blur. We also don't want film grain, so turn that down. All of those things are really not going to be helpful to overall visual fidelity and visibility as we play. First and third person camera movements, we want to turn these down to their least values, so 50%. This will just limit the amount of unnecessary screen shake we have when we're playing the game, which once again helps with visibility. Third person ADS transition, I don't care because there is no third person in the game, so do what you want with it. Spectator camera, I would recommend you put this to game perspective. Why they ever added the helmet camera thing, I don't know. I don't find it helpful whatsoever. Game perspective is king. That's like the classic where if you happen to die and you spectate your teammate, it will look like you are literally in their shoes and playing the game, as opposed to being a camera on the side of their head, which isn't very helpful. And lastly, inverted flashbang. It's a bit of personal preference. If you turn this on, it will make flashbangs actually darken your screen rather than making the screen blow up white. I just left this off because I'm so used to the fact that if my screen goes white, a flashbang's hit me, as opposed to this right option where I think my game's crashed or something like that. So personal preference, I prefer to leave it off. Now that we're done with the in-game settings, you can save all that, close your game, and we're going to look at the config file. Now, this is just as important as the in-game settings, and it's going to squeeze out every last bit of performance out of the game as possible. To get to this config file, you just need to go to your Documents folder, then Call of Duty, and then Players. You'll see a bunch of these different files in here. They are CST files, but we're able to edit these using Notepad. So the one we're going to edit is options.4.cod23. You might not see the .cst bit because your file extensions might be turned off, but options for COD23. You should be able to right click it and click edit or open, and it will open it into a notepad editor like so we can start messing around with it. First setting we're changing in here is renderer work account. It's literally 2 down from the top, so very easy to find, and this is going to determine how much of our CPU is being used as we play the game. A lot of different numbers getting thrown around here. The simple answer is you want to set this to the number of cores that your PC has, not the number of threads. Let me explain. The best way to find the answer to this is search up on Google your CPU. So for example, this is an i7-8700K by Intel. If you look down here, this has 6 total cores and 12 total threads. In this scenario, you'd want to put the number in the config file to 6. We can have a look at an AMD example as well. This is the AMD, which one is it? The 5800X 3D. Scroll on down. It says number of CPU cores 8, number of threads 16, so 2 times the amount of cores. We would want to set the config file to 8. There is one more kind of interesting scenario though, and that's if you've got one of the newer Intel CPUs, which is what I have. I have this specific one actually, the 12700K. Now these Intel CPUs come with efficient cores and performance cores, which then gives a total cores up here. So 4, 8, and 12. Well, which number should you use? To put it simply, you want to just select the number of performance cores. Completely ignore the efficient ones. They're not ones we're going to try and use. So for this example, if you have one of these CPUs, you would use 8. To find the next setting, we're going to do Control F on our keyboard to bring up the Find dialog. Then you're going to search for corpse. It will bring you down to corpse limit, maximum number of AI corpses. This shouldn't have any effect in Warzone, in theory, but as a safe bet, I would bring this down to 0, just in case there are any corpses of anything which could appear. We're going to just limit them down to 0 so they don't hang around and take up any performance on the game. Next, we've got these next 3 options: show blood, blood limit, and blood limit interval. Turning off blood by turning the first one from true to false really helps stay on target when you're spraying down an enemy. Having blood clouds appear out of enemies is not going to help you stay on target. Definitely turn this off by putting this to false. Limit blood effects, I would put this to true. And then blood limit interval, put this all the way to the max, so 2000 as it says over here. That's the maximum. This is going to maximize the amount of time between potential blood effects that could cause any kind of performance or visibility problems. Below that, you've got show brass. I turn this off as well because I just think it's, once again, more visual clutter. Press Control F again and do another search for corpse. You'll find another corpse setting called corpse's culling threshold. We want to put this to the lowest setting, so just copy the string of numbers over here, 0.5 and then 5 zeros, and paste that in between the 2 inverted commas. Just below that, Catmull-Clark subdivision level. This should determine the quality of geometry of certain objects. The higher this is, the better and more defined objects look. I've been turning this all the way down to 0, the lowest option. It's gaining me a few FPS and the game looks no different. Next, you want to search for sun and you'll find Sun Shadow Cascade. This one, you definitely want to copy the entire string so you don't get it wrong. You're going to copy this entire lowest setting. This has a pretty heavy effect on what the shadows look like in game. It does make them look a lot more blurry. They're still there for when you need them, but they definitely look a lot worse. And you do gain a decent amount of FPS from doing this. So once again, just copy it from over here, paste it over here, so we've got low 1 cascade in between the inverted commas. Do find again and search for probe. You'll find reflection probe relighting. Turn this all the way down to the lowest option, which is 1, for a nice extra little bit of FPS boost in relation to reflections. Next one I want you to do is search for virtual. It should bring you to virtual texturing memory mode. I saw a lot of people recommending to turn this all the way to the lowest setting. Not what you want to do. You actually want to leave this at large and even maybe try extra large, giving the game as much memory as possible in terms of how it's storing textures in the memory will make your game run a lot smoother, less hitching, less 1% lows. Just scroll down 3 settings and you'll have GPU upload heaps. This should be helping out your system by enabling what's called resizable bar, which allows more data to be uploaded to your VRAM in your GPU. However, it's causing a lot more 1% low dropping off. It's a bit of a contested topic at the moment. I would recommend right now, until we have more confirmation that this isn't affecting your game in a negative way, that you turn this to false. One setting below that, enable velocity-based blur. Hell no, let's get rid of that for sure. I don't want any radial motion blur related to my player velocity. Sounds horrible. And the last 2 things I'd recommend you change in here, just a personal preference. The first bit's in the interface setting just below. Let's put skip intro to true, and let's put view splash screen to false. This will just get you past all of that annoying intro stuff that comes when the game first starts up. Every single time, it'll get you straight into the menu and into game as quick as possible. Now that we've done all that, make sure you press Control then S on your keyboard so that the document is saved, and you can then just click the X icon and close it down. Now, before we jump back in game and begin playing, there are 2 Windows settings that you need to check are enabled. The first one, come down to your start menu and type in game mode. Open up game mode settings and make sure this is on. This is just a universal thing for Windows PCs that makes games run that little bit better. The second one, close this down and search for graphics. You're going to find graphics settings, open this up, and you'll find hardware accelerated GPU scheduling, or HAGS. It says that it should reduce latency and improve performance. Throughout the whole of, I believe, Warzone 1 and Warzone 2, having this on was negatively affecting performance, specifically for that game, which was really annoying, because if you played multiple games, you kind of had to come and keep turning this on and off. Luckily, in Modern Warfare 3 multiplayer and Warzone, this does help out, giving you that little bit of a performance boost. So make sure this is on. You might have to restart your PC to actually engage this stuff before we jump back in game. So now we've got those in-game config file and Windows settings sorted, you need to go and watch this video next, where I'll take you guys through the best settings in the NVIDIA control panel for Modern Warfare 3 multiplayer and Warzone Season 1.